Your thing, go for it. Let's talk about the set makeup of wedges. Let's talk about the length of wedges in your set and the swing weights of the wedges in your set. This is pretty interesting, and it's a way for you to go about and do a little checking to see how your wedges actually fit into your set. And also maybe do a little bit of additional thinking on the set makeup of your wedges. Most iron sets come with a pitching wedge, and definitely we want a pitching wedge in our set. The other wedge that we definitely have to have in our set is a sand club. Now there are three other kinds of wedges besides pitching and sand, and that's the gap wedge, which fills in between the pitching wedge and the sand wedge. Then there's the lob 60-degree wedge, and then there's the ultra lob wedge that goes up to the 63, 64-degree range. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, there are very, very few people that ever need to go to a 62, 3 or 4-degree ultra lob wedge, and I would kind of forget that club. If you do own one, count the number of times you hit it good and the number of times you hit it bad, and I'll guarantee you after you count it and you mark it all up and you take a score, you're going to chunk it out of your set anyway. So what I want to do here is, this is kind of a neat little talk, and here's something you can do. Run out to your bag of clubs and get your clubs and set them up on a table. Now you need a nice straight edge on the table. You're going to lay out your irons, and I have 4-through pitching wedge right here between my fingers. So I'm going to lay my irons out, and on the other end of the table, as you can see, I have each of the ferrules put up against the nice straight edge of the table so that I can look at the exact incremental length in my irons from the 4-iron, in this case, down to the pitching wedge. So you can see that I've got a 1/2 inch from the 4 to the 5, a 1/2 inch, a 1/2 inch, a 1/2 inch, a 1/2 inch right down to the pitch. So neat way to kind of check your irons out. Now I want you to also lay out your wedges. And when you put your wedges down on the table, we want to see where they're at. I'll bet in some cases you got a wedge that's a sand or a gap or a lob that's longer than your pitch, possibly. Run into that a lot. Or they're all the same length as your pitch. Well, that's not the ideal situation. What you really want to do is get your wedges set up so that they're basically in kind of an incremental order, sort of, to the clubs in your set. We're looking for consistency in length, consistency of feel, consistency of distance. We don't want wedges, and what do? We go out and we just pick up a wedge here, we pick up a wedge there, and we pick up a wedge here. So we don't exactly know where they're at, and we probably never check them. Some of the touring players I get in here don't check them, and I find this out, and they're going, oh man, that sand club always felt too long to me. Can we cut it down a 1/2 inch? Can we? Yes, we can. We'll get it all fixed up. So here's the deal. I've got a gap wedge here, and in an ideal situation, I'd like my gap wedge a 1/2 inch shorter than my pitching wedge. Got a sand wedge here. I really prefer to see the sand wedge a 1/2 inch shorter than the gap wedge. Then I've got a lob wedge here, a 60-degree. Well, in the case right here, I've got the lob wedge and the sand wedge the same length. I don't want to start getting too short on my wedges, and if I have a gap wedge, I'm going to make the lob wedge and the sand wedge the same length. Now, there is a situation where you can get rid of the gap wedge, and that's entirely up to you. I like to be able to put in another hybrid or some other club that may help me better, but you need to understand what's happening when you get rid of the gap wedge, and then how do I solve that problem? Well, when I take the gap wedge out, first off, here's what I want to do on length. I want to take the length of my sand club and increase the length a 1/2 inch from what I just showed you to make it a 1/2 inch shorter than my pitching wedge. I'm going to leave my lob 60-degree wedge the same length, which is a 1/2 inch shorter than the sand wedge. So I go pitching wedge, sand wedge, lob wedge, all a 1/2 inch shorter in increments right there. Now, when I take the gap wedge out, and here's what the manufacturers have done over the years, it's the stupidest thing. We have taken and made loft so strong on our irons that we now end up with a pitching wedge, say, of 47, 48 degrees. We've got a sand wedge of 56, so we've got 8 degrees between those two. That's a lot, and that's where the gap wedge came in. And if you really need a gap wedge, go for it. But I don't use a gap wedge, and a lot of touring players don't use gap wedges, and a lot of good players don't use gap wedges, because I want another club, as I said before, that can help me more. So when I take the gap wedge out, what in the world do? Well, I have a pitching wedge, and I can take, and this is a pretty easy shot to learn, is you take a pitching wedge and you hit it 7/8 to 3/4, and that makes up for the gap wedge. And then you hit your pitching wedge full. So you've got kind of 3 shots with a pitching wedge, then the gap wedge can come out. And I told you before, you don't want the 63 or 64 big lofted thing. There are 2 wedges you definitely have to have in your bag, pitch, and sand. The 60-degree wedge can help out in a lot of situations, but what you need to do is fully understand, do I hit the 60 consistently enough? Is it something that really helps me in my game? If it does, leave it in. So in looking at the set makeup of your wedges, use that kind of as a criteria. Now we go back and we do the other two things, or the other thing rather is swing weight. We've talked about the length, we've talked about the set makeup of wedges in general. Swing weight wise, the pitching wedge that comes with your set should be 2 or 3 swing weights heavier than whatever your iron swing weight at. If your iron swing weight at, let's say, D2, your pitching wedge should be D3, 4, or 5. Your sand wedge should always be basically 4 to 6 swing weights heavier than the irons in the set, so that'd make the sand wedge anywhere from D6, D8, something like that. I also like to see the 60-degree wedge basically in that same similar range as the sand club, although it could be lighter if you have a personal preference. The gap wedge should be the same as the pitching wedge, D3, 4, and 5, if your iron set's a D2. So you want your wedges heavier, obviously. They have a certain function to do. You're not out to get a pitching wedge and hit it 971 yards because your buddy hits it that far. The idea of the wedges, they're scoring clubs, they're accuracy clubs, and we want to use them as such, and the heavier head weights and the higher swing weights help us do that. So take a good look at your wedges, get them all laid out on a table like this, find out where you stand, because one of the fun things when you want to get into doing some things on clubs is to either cut down your wedges a little bit, re-grip them, add a little lead tape to them, get them to where you want them and they feel the best, and I guarantee you it'll help you play better.